So today we're going to talk about what modern architecture is, what it's not, what modern architecture means to us, and how we approach it in our office. And the reason why we're having this conversation is because I feel like the vast majority of people who are not architects have the wrong idea when they think about modern architecture. And this kind of misunderstanding creates a lot of confusion between architects and everyone else.
I think especially when clients are looking to hire an architect, and they're trying to describe what they like or what they don't like, and the word modern is thrown around quite a bit. And then the architect's trying to explain what they do and what style they do. And so the word modern is overused, I think, but not always in the right way.
Agreed. And then also, this conversation ties into the broader subject of styles in architecture.
Of course, yeah.
So other words that we're going to talk about are like modern, modern farmhouse, colonial, French chateau, Cape Cod style, Spanish, Mediterranean. All these words are used oftentimes, and it also adds to the confusion. But maybe what we can do is do a brief history lesson of sorts and talk about, like, when we say modern architecture, what does that actually mean in the historical sense? Like, what are some of the key principles in classic modern architecture? No, classic's not the right word, but in modern architecture when it first started to take shape.
I find it very funny that you asked me to tell you more about the history of modern architecture, given that I am from Europe, and this is where the old
that's
stuff
like the wrong.
is.
Yeah, I got you.
But I would, take you up to the challenge. So, in summary, there is old architecture, there is modern architecture.
Oh no.
No, but so I think the notion of modern architecture came about late 19th century, early 20th century, and it's also coincided with the second industrial revolution, where we basically learned how to make things, manufacture things differently.
Yeah,
and I think that really questioned like how we thought about all of the things that we've been carrying forward with us from the past, right? We learned to make buildings differently, like build with steel, build taller, elevators
lots
came
of
about.
glass.
And then even within, like, I think the home and the living, living in a home, there's a lot of like revolution in terms of design. So it kind of all came about. I think it's very interesting actually if you look at industrial design and architecture and
They're
how
closely related.
The close relationship they had in how they evolved, right? I think is very, very interesting. But so the differences between, let's say, more old classical architecture versus modern, I think is the abandon of ornamentation is a big one, right? There is a hunt for kind of like leaving behind the what you call it, the extras, the fluff,
Superfluous things.
the superfluous, and really just focus on the purity of the form or the function. So that's where the notion, form follows function came about, right? Yeah. And in a way, it was maybe very radical at the time modern architecture came about. I think over time, modern architecture got more nuanced and found its way back with maybe a little bit more of ornamentation or a little bit of, character, sensibility to, the human scale and feelings.
And emotion of
and
space.
Emotions, right?
Yeah, so I think in summary, there's three kind of key traits to modern architecture of that time when it first started taking shape. The first is the principle that form follows function, which everyone has heard. And actually in architectural discourse, that's been interrogated quite heavily. We're not going to get into the academics of how that can be interpreted in different ways. The core definition that's broadly adopted means that the shape and the look of the building is driven by the function of the building and nothing else. So if the function of the building is to be a school, so it's program driven, it's structure driven, it's things that are not questionable, right? That drives the form rather than an external decision, which would seem to be arbitrary or superfluous. And that ties into, of course, the second point, which is the rejection of ornamentation. And then thirdly, which you touched on, is the adoption of new technologies or building methods. And what I think is interesting about the modern architecture, if we compare it to classical, like true classical architecture, is that like people have to understand that, first of all architecture is a result and expression of the time in which it's created, right?
Right.
And so as an architect, that means you're always looking for what's around you within your historical period and the technologies at your disposal to create something that has meaning. And I use the word meaning intentionally because if you go back to classical architecture, meaning was found in the orders. There were books that prescribed what you do to create a good work of architecture. And so if you're an architect, you would look to the books, the volumes, and they would say, use a Doric column in this place, in this matter. And that basically tells you you're following the orders. So therefore, the architecture is good and therefore it has meaning.
I think also the meaning also came from like the use of symbols in architecture and
time,
therefore
yes.
the ornamentation, right?
Yeah.
And that's a very strong parallel to the arts. I mean, if you look at paintings, there is obviously symbolism behind specific objects and colors and where things are located on a canvas, for example.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it seems like in a way maybe older architecture was a bit more artistic in its way.
Mm-hmm.
And also
Go ahead.
right, and it might have been also like an evolution over time, like we started in a cave and then we built like a castle in the middle age that were kind of like just like stacks of stones, and then we made them look pretty, and just kind of over time the ornamentation and the artistic dimension of architecture got maybe overdeveloped, let's say, right? And maybe that's where architects felt like it needed kind of a revolution within the style and kind of like start from scratch, and form follows function kind of goes back to the very primitive aspect of what architecture needs to be, right?
And what it needs to be is all that it needs to be, and nothing more.
And to that criticism, to that point, you can criticize modern architecture for being too cold and not sensible to the environment.
Well, so this is what I'm saying, right? The meaning of architecture came from prescribed the orders, which layered on a lot of decoration. Also, it's very important to note that the orders and these rule sets all stem from religion, right? So there is let's say a monoculture, which was driving all of this. And then when we get to a point where we have new technologies, the steel and the glass, let's say, namely, we are also no longer a monoculture, especially in the United States. It's a heteroculture. Now, as an architect, the question is, when I put pen to paper, how do I draw something that has meaning? Because I can't refer back to the classical orders because it's not relevant anymore, right? So the answer became, well, form follows. Let it be what it's supposed to be, and that's it. Like a column, for example. Think of a classical column. You have the different types. They're highly ornamented. There's a lot of different stuff going on with them. A modern column at the turn of the century would have been, it's a post. And what is it there to do? It's there to hold up the slab above it. It's just a post. Don't adorn the post. Don't put anything on the post. The post is the post and has meaning because of its structure and where it needs to go. And that's it. And I think I understand. And so like when you're talking about cold architecture, like I think of the international movement, very, very stripped down, expressive of the kind of, we call it like factory aesthetic, let's say. I get why that would be the next step, the first step in finding meaning in architecture, because there's nothing else to refer to, right? Again, it's a heteroculture. But I also agree that when you try to say all architecture should follow this ism that's stripped down of everything, that it ends up being, as a whole, it can be quite bland when it's done poorly.
And I think we're kind of going on tangents here, but I think it also ties to, a building feeling placeless. Like somehow over time, I think the ornamentation created vernacular in specific places, right? And if you strip that down, you just kind of like back to the bare bones of a building and the masses and the volume and the light and kind of like the basic ingredient of what makes a building that could be really good. If you don't have ornamentation or craftsmanship or details, how do you make it feel not placeless?
So here's a question then. So we're talking about like the first iteration of modernism and modern architecture. People listening might be wondering, well, do you prescribe to that? Is that how you adopt and practice and think about your work in modern architecture? And the answer is no. First of all, this is getting into the details of what it means to design. There are 70,000 decisions that an architect has to make over the course of a project on average. It's not possible for every one of those decisions to be like dry and objective. There is a subjective layer. Not subjective is not the right word. There's an aesthetic component to all the decisions that we make. So this idea that only form follows function, there's no ornament, I kind of question that, because like let's say, for example, if you're locating a window on a wall and it's for light, right? Well, that window could be square, rectangular, circular. It could be here or there. And roughly the same amount of light's going to come into the room. So what dictates where that window should be and what shape it should be? It is, in some degree, an aesthetic choice. And there's other stuff we'll talk about later on that factors into the decision-making. But it is, in some level, an aesthetic choice, which, for me, square window versus triangle window, would you say a triangle window is considered ornamentation? Because it is not a square window. We all kind of default to thinking 90 degrees, geometry is unbiased.
But it's funny because a square or circle or a triangle is still a man-made shape.
I don't think it's possible to reject the idea of ornamentation entirely.
No, I don't, yeah. You also mentioned something that, architecture kind of like is a reflection of its time, and culture kind of like time and place and people. And to that end, it's interesting because I feel like the word modern always means like something that's futuristic, right? But in fact, it's oftentimes like, it might be like just a few years ahead or something, but it's oftentimes more like current, right? And to that point, like, I don't know, medieval architecture was modern for its time, maybe.
Yeah.
But it got called medieval architecture after that time had passed, in a way. So whatever modern architecture is today will not be modern in 10 years from now.
So this is also why it's really confusing. So the other word to describe architecture, which I feel is more appropriate when I'm speaking to people, is contemporary. And contemporary just means of its time. Right. Of now, of the time that we're in now. I've been asked by potential clients, what kind of architecture do you do? Or do you do contemporary architecture? Is that the style? Would you describe your style of architecture as contemporary? And I'm like, well, yes, because I am living now and I'm producing it now. So it is of its time. I think in some ways it's a more accurate term than modern, but modern now means it generally refers to a specific point in history in retrospect. So to some degree, like, all these words are really kind of like only useful as a way to classify things in retrospect. But I think simultaneously for us, because I would say we do modern architecture, there are principles of the core initial modernist movement that are embedded into our work, but we expand to go beyond that. I also think that modernism and the modern mentality is maybe more important than formally what it produces. And what it means to be a modernist is to think about, again, the contemporary setting that you're in place, your place within, to analyze it, digest it, and then channel that into their work, but also think about, where do we want to go as a society? And this extends to architecture that's the scale of a house, architecture that's public facing, like libraries, museums, whatever else, and larger things like urban design scale, right? All of us who are practicing and designing the built environment, i.e. architecture and architects, that's actually what we're thinking about. Like, what about now makes sense to have something, a sculpture and a structure that's an expression of our principles and our belief system, broadly speaking, and where we want to be going. And I think that futurist mentality is very much what it means to be a modern architect. It's much more about that rather than saying, what are the formal principles you have to follow.
So that's what I think that really is the meaning of modern architecture. It's not really the form. I think it is more about the mentality and the approach to designing architecture. Right. And this is where maybe when architects say, like, I do modern architecture, and clients describe oh, I like modern architecture, there's kind of a discrepancy in the approach because the client has a tendency to focus on the final product, and that is what they like, when the architect is most likely trying to express how they're thinking about design when they're trying to onboard 100%. A client, right? I mean, there's architects who are very, clear. This is the only style I will be doing for my career, and this is what you want to hire me for, right? But I think most contemporary architects are modern architects in the sense that they're kind of up for the challenge, and they're interested and intrigued by taking on a project and thinking about it and questioning it and inventing or reinventing it, right? And this is very much like the modern approach to design.
So this also gets to the psychology of the architect versus the average homeowner, i.e. potential client. Is, I'm just repeating what you said, but the clients and homeowners tend to think of architecture as, again, they see it as a sculpture, and they need to describe that sculpture, so they use words to, like, styles, right? But architects, when we're creating our work, we don't think of it that way at all. I'll say this. So,
and that's not the end user fault, because that's how architecture is presented to them on, like,
HGTV,
the day-to-day life that we're in.
I know. To further explain this, the severity of this discrepancy. So going back in time, when you're an architect or you're an aspiring architect and you go to school, right? Architectural school in college is, for people who don't know, is a very intense 5 to 6 years of your life, and it is completely transformative. Is, in fact, we speak to a lot of architects on here and outside of the podcast. It is the one thing, truly the one thing, that binds us together as a species. It's the one thing we have the most in common, is the feeling of what it means to be an architecture student up late at night, struggling to figure out how to design, to produce this thing, to produce floor plans, produce a model, and find meaning in your creation without a lot of help. It is the one thing that unifies us. So much so that all the top schools, their curriculum is roughly the same, right? They're all teaching the same broad principles of design and architecture. And in all those schools, you are never taught you're going to learn how to design modern architecture. So we have architectural history courses where we learn about classical stuff, go all the way through up until modernism, postmodernism, deconstructivism, blah, 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 right? Fine. That's architectural history taught in a big lecture hall. In the design and architecture studio, where you're actually making projects and learning how to design, and you have a studio professor, my entire time in being in school and all the places that I've taught or been a critic at, I've never heard any teacher describe the work that students are doing as saying, today we're going to learn how to do modern architecture, how to produce it. Tomorrow it's classical. The next day, the next week or whatever is Mediterranean, and then Spanish style, then Spanish colonial, then Cape Cod. You are not taught these styles and how to use them in school. In fact, Cape Cod and a lot of the words that we hear in the residential space, I didn't even hear them in architectural history. So now, then the question people have is like, okay, people listen like, well, what do you produce in school if it's not modern architecture? It is, by most people's definitions, it is modern work. It's not French Chateau. It's not Cape Cod, whatever. It's modern, but we don't think of it that way. So what happens is then when you finish school and then you go out into the world and you have your own office or talking to the average person, they throw out all these words like I've mentioned, and then for the let's say newer architect, they're like, what? What do you mean? What do you mean? Do I do modern architecture? What do you mean? Do I do French Chateau? No, I don't do French Chateau. What do you mean by modern? I just do architecture. So architecture in school, architecture as a broad profession, none of us think of ourselves in terms of styles. At least the ones that are revered within our industry, win awards, and are published. Like it doesn't exist. When you were in school, you were in Europe. I was
just gonna say, I have a scoop for you. Is even in France, they don't teach you how to do French chateaus.
Mind blown. Because they're just chateaus, right?
Well, no, but it is very interesting because you are right. We went to school in different countries, in different places, in different parts of the world, and still architecture is taught in a similar way, right? And I didn't have also any design studio that was requiring to operate within certain styles. It was like, here is the project brief, do whatever you think is right. And with those parameters, I don't think I've ever seen any design student proposing anything from an older style besides working within the era they were living in. Which, you know, I don't know. I think it also says a lot. It says that architects are creators. Like, I think, you know, from a very young age, when you join architecture school, you are interested in design, you're interested in creating. So why would you be replicating something that someone else did in the past, probably 100 times better than you could do it today, right?
And it was appropriate for the time and the ethos of the time. Yeah.
And, you know, to the point of like, it is right. Like, I mean, we live in California, and there is all kinds of styles in California you could, you know, find, which is always making me feeling very perplexed, because I'm like, French chateau in LA, like that is therefore not a French chateau. It is not in France.
It's Las Vegas.
And you know, I'm thinking about that. Does this exist in France? Like, do you have, like, I don't know, Spanish style or whatever? You probably have them, and you have them because it's probably the region that is next to Spain, and the style just kind of made it across the border. And that is, again, like how the influence travel and the design travels. You know, like you might find Tuscany homes in the, you know, on the French Riviera, because you can see Italy on the other side of the Riviera.
It is in or
right?
near Tuscany,
like,
yes.
You wouldn't find a Tuscany home in the north of France, because people would be like, what? Does not belong there.
There's a couple things I want to pick up on. The first is the search as an architect for authenticity in your work. And there's something very inauthentic and dishonest even to transplanting styles that have nothing to do with, again, the local culture or the contemporary culture, you know, speaking of timelines. It feels perverse. Like I said, it feels like Las Vegas. The other thing that you mentioned is
and I think that, you know, and there is architects who do that, and, you know, to each their own, but I think those architects are not obviously not modernist. Like, their approach to architecture is, let's say, historical architecture, but, or I don't know, replicate.
So a lot of the styles that have been brought up, like I mentioned, like Cape Cod, colonial, whatever, these are called revivalist styles. The word is self-explanatory. You are reviving a style from a previous era or a different place. It's a revivalist style.
Sounds like a zombie revival.
Yeah, to put in the context, though.
Sounds like something was dead and you're trying to bring it back to life.
So, like you said, there are definitely architects who do practice and do colonial, like whatever things, right? I do want to reemphasize to the audience listening, though, that I'm serious. In school and then in the profession, no one talks about these people. These not to I'm not trying to put down these architects, because it doesn't mean their work is bad either. That's another subject. But there's no architecture publication, there's no awards, there's no school, there's no nothing where anyone cares about an architect who's producing classical architecture, even if it's great classical architecture, right? Because there's nothing new there. And going to your point about the architect as a creative person, you know, the cliche narrative of how one becomes an architect, or when they first knew that they were going to be an architect, is when they're a kid and they're playing with blocks or Legos and they're creating things from their imagination using nothing, or it's cardboard and scissors and duct tape in my case. You are birthing something out of, quote, nothing, and that's the charge. That is the passion. That's what really gets us excited. So in fact, it is completely antithetical to the makeup of that type of individual to be asked, are you interested in our revivalist style?
You know, I think it's,
I
if you think about the parallels with fashion, right? Let's say someone who make costumes and dresses from, again, the Renaissance, is a very different fashion designer than the ones who are, working on Fashion Week for 2026. And I think there's kind of like, parallels to that, right? It's like, they're each very talented. They each play with like different sets of constraints, but one is, like you said, it's reviving something. It's not really creating something from zero. They're still creating because they're putting the parts together. They're thinking about how to put the parts together, but they're not inventing the parts. They're not questioning the parts. They're not trying to create new parts, right?
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. Again, if you think about, fashion with architecture, when a client reaches out to you and that says like, I want a French chateau, and you do modern architecture, it's kind of like, well, it's not that I can't do it, but it's not really like who I am at the core,
No.
right?
Yeah.
And I think if you have beliefs and kind of like also respect for who you are as a person, like you will want to do it because you know, first of all, you're not gonna have fun. That's not like you're not going to enjoy doing it as much as you would if you were doing, you know, one of the modern projects. So I'm just saying that because sometimes architects think that, or sometimes kind of think that they could, you know, not force an architect on a project, but make it work.
Right.
And I think that's where you actually completely lose the meaning of what it is to hire an architect, whichever if it's a revivalist or a modernist.
But that's
right?
a really good point, though, this because I think a lot of people think that the architect has the technical skill set to do different things. So why don't you do different things? Actually, I was speaking with a contractor who was trained as an architect, and he made the same comment. I'm like, dude, did you even listen when you were in architecture school? He's like, I don't get why architecture is so picky about doing different, you know, a style that's not theirs. I'm like, yeah, that's why you're a contractor, because you don't get it, right? You don't know what it means to actually design something and have your soul into that creation. It's not possible for me to do a true copy and paste. However, is it possible to do a modern version of some other style or some other thing and be inspired by something else? 100%. And maybe this gets to later on in the conversation, but I think that's a very rich source of material and a way to approach a project. Because when you're faced with creating a house from scratch and you're looking at this blank piece of paper with some boundaries of a site and some trees that are on there, it's a question of like, what is driving my decision making? Okay, I have program, yes. I have X amount of square feet, yes. I have all these kind of like pragmatic things to deal with, yes. I have the sun orientation, the wind and whatever. That's not enough to drive the actual decision making. Like at my window example before, who's to say it should be this window or that window, as long as I have a window?
You know, the other thing that I was realizing when you were talking is why I think like I'm a modernist and not like I could not operate as a revivalist,
Sure.
Is because of the urge for creation. I mean, even and the thing that you could discover or uncover something super great that could potentially, you know, change how people live, change how other architects think about architecture, right? I mean, even if you think again, you know, like designing with your time and for the people of your time, any major building that was done in the past was modern for its time because they were trying to push things in a new direction or forward, right? And and in a way, I do think as if you are an architect, you kind of have to do that.
That's our responsibility.
Like you can't just operate in the past.
No.
I mean, a few of us could, but not everyone in the group of architects could do that, could afford to do that.
No, I mean, if you think about it, right, we have three things: food, clothing, shelter. And then belief systems as a fourth, let's say, but material things, food, clothing, shelter, to survival. And those things exist and we produce them not just to survive, but to become, again, an expression of who we are as a species and where we want to go. So this for people who are not architects, like these guys are crazy. You take your job too seriously, but really this is how architects think. This is what we think. When we produce something, it has to be forward looking because what are we doing otherwise? You know. I mean, you know, it's our responsibility. Buildings last for such a long time, especially when we talk about larger structures, like again community oriented ones like museums. We cannot afford to look backward. Right, we are putting a mostly permanent giant work of structure that costs a lot of money in the city that's now part of the city, right? And it has to be appropriate. It has to be positive. It can't be backward looking. I mean, it's the wrong thing to do in my book if you are not pushing and evolving, because every building that we do is a drop in the bucket for where we're going as a species. And I know that chefs and I know that fashion designers think the same way about what they do, right? It's all trying to make something better than before. You can't do that if you're copying pasting.
No, and we are an evolving species, right? And so
the
everything we touch is evolving in a way, you know. I don't know. I found it very...
Well, so here's the thing. So like sometimes we hear from people talking about specific misconceptions. People think that modern architecture is hiring an architect who's going to do modern architecture is going to produce like a very limited set of, it's going to be restraining, right? They only have a certain kind of like amount of choices to make. It's going to look a certain way in the end. Like the form, the look, whatever is kind of dictated by this idea of a modern style.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I feel like it's often like a negative thing because they associate modern architecture with cold, minimal, not user-friendly, things you see in like, fancy glossy magazines, but no one actually lives into.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's because the way the term modern is being taught to people through media is about the form, and it is not about the approach. Right.
I actually think
that said, though, there is offices that focus only on that, let's say, that color of modern architecture.
Right.
Right. They only play by those rules.
Sure. And that gets into maybe more like the personal style of an office or an architect. I'd actually say, though, that the idea that modern architecture is limiting or restraining is wrong. It's the opposite. That's the whole point.
It's the complete opposite.
The whole point of modern architecture is to have the freedom to question everything that you're doing from a functional stance, from an aesthetic standpoint, from building technology to everything about it. It's everything's on the table to be questioned when you're doing modern architecture.
But I think again that misconception of the word modern architecture is because the meaning of that word has been taught from what it was when it first came out. Right. And when it first came out, modern architecture was maybe cold and minimal, right?
Sure.
But modern architecture has evolved, and modern architecture can be many things. And I think that's the thing that's not really being explained to people today, is that modern architecture can take any shape or form.
Again, because it's about an ethos and a philosophy. Yeah. But to your point about what they envision when they think of the word modern architecture.
Even yourself, if you think modern, what comes to your mind? Like sharp edges, clean surfaces, no detail, right? Like
I don't know. I mean, for me, since I'm a dreamy architect, I just think an architect who dreams. I'm not physically dreamy, to clarify that. I don't know if I really think of any. I probably think about whatever our latest project is that's floating out in my mind, But for the average person, going to your point of people's definitions and idea, their visualization of modern architecture is based on what they've seen, which is totally fair. And why would it be anything else? And a lot of what they've seen locally here, let's say in California, Southern California specifically, actually all of California, and this probably applies to most of the United States. When people say modern architecture, I don't want modern architecture, they're thinking of, and what's a house? They're thinking of a white stucco box with some shitty black framed window and a downspout going down the side of the building. No sensitivity to proportions, scale, no aesthetic value, and there's of course a massive drip edge at the top, which is like made of some kind of like tinfoil light gauge steel, so it's all warped. That is what people think of when they think of modern. They have that definition because, frankly, the majority of modern architecture houses is that kind of shit.
Well, and because there is no other word than the word modern to describe those buildings.
Shitbox would be the word.
If you think about it. No, but it's funny you say that because, I grew up, for example, in like a very small town, right? And actually the house I grew up in was built in the 70s. So it was modern,
right,
in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, you get it now. It's nothing modern about it for today, but for back then it was modern. But my parents and even myself growing up, like we always put value on like the older buildings and not really like the modern buildings, let's say. And anything that was modern or let's say newer was always kind of bad.
Because
it was never really well done. And
sure.
And kind of like as a side note, I do think that it's very hard. Well, maybe northern countries of Europe are a little bit more skilled at those to do like really good modern buildings in Europe than maybe it is here, because obviously this is a younger country and they've been like you guys have been doing modern for like a lot longer and I think a lot more commonly. But anything that was newer construction just was always crap.
Yeah.
So therefore, there is always this association of modern means bad.
In Europe, in your hometown at least.
And it's funny because even to this day, I would take my parents, to the States and see different cities and see some cool architecture and modern buildings. And buildings are actually, like well made and well designed. But because they're modern, there is always kind of like I don't want to give my emotions to those buildings. Like I don't feel the connection. And I found it very interesting.
Well, there's definitely an aesthetic. So going back to comparing, let's say, classical or traditional architecture to modern architecture and people having the preferences and the idea that modern architecture is cold. The thing is that the one style of architecture or versus another doesn't mean that it's good or bad inherently. Like just because a building is modern in its ethos or in its design does not make it good. The same thing goes the opposite for anything traditional. It doesn't mean it's bad either. But what I'm saying is that the volume of work that people see in houses is mostly bad. And so that becomes their idea of what modern is. And it's a real problem. This is a separate subject, but it's a real problem because the vast majority of these buildings were done by developers, contractors who pretend to be designers, homeowners who don't decide to hire an architect or can't afford one, whatever the reason may be. And people just get brainwashed into thinking, X means something when it absolutely does not. What's even more confusing is that these words are often used in real estate, obviously. I'm reminded we were walking down the street the other day, that was neighborhood, and there's this house for sale. So we went on Zillow to look it up and see, what it was priced at and all this kind of stuff. And walking by it, it's a single story California ranch house, which means it's pitch roof with asphalt shingles, punch window open. It's like nothing special, just a house.
Pretty
basic house, front yard with a two-car garage, like just the typical kind of thing. My favorite. And on the listing it said style. I think it said mid-century. And I'm like, no. This is not a mid-century modern style house. It was built in the mid-century. But because it was built in the mid-century doesn't mean it has a mid-century style to it. So we as a collective, community, broad population, looping in homeowners and real estate agents and everyone, we just use these words whenever it's convenient to make something sound better for the wrong reasons in that case, right? Or because we have nothing else to draw on because everyone's uneducated. And
because you can say it's a basic house, it's a basic style.
It's a question that I get asked often is, well, sometimes when I go to see someone's house, they're like, what do you think of my house? I'm like, don't ask me that question.
Do you really think you want to know the answer?
But the other is like, what style would you call that house? And a lot of times
no style
I don't, it's not a style. There's no style. It's not a style. It's just a building. It's just a building. And I do distinguish building from
You're like
architecture.
A dream crusher. Oh, no. What do you think of this house? I'm thinking of buying it. What style do you think it is?
It's not a style.
It's not. There's no style to this house.
It's not a style. It is a developer who bought a piece of land, built something cheap that they thought was going to be mass, appealing to the market, and they labeled it something on Zillow. It's not a style. I don't care what your real estate agent says. They know fuck all about architecture. It's not a style. It's a nothing building. And not to be more depressing, but the vast majority of our built environment is nothing. Is nothingness.
Yeah, and
is of that nothingness.
And look, it's like in the ocean, right? I love analogy. Did you notice?
Yeah.
It's like in the ocean. There is a lot of different fish. There is the pretty one. There is the dangerous one. There is the big one. There is the cute one. There is the fast one. And then there is the ones that just make for most population of fish, and they're just plankton. And they're nothing more than that. I do think we need. I don't think. I mean, going back to a few recordings we've done, a few episodes ago. I do think that not every building needs to be a piece of architecture. Like, I think you do need some background buildings, and you do need some background houses, like the no-style home. And, those are perfectly fine. But I only have issues with those when, for example, for a sale, we're trying to label them something they're not. Like, again,
it's so brutal.
I just feel bad for the buyers, for example, for this house, because they're getting ripped off.
No.
Like we just tack on a few words and that adds a few $100,000 to the price, and that's it, when in fact that's not what you're getting. So I have issues with that more than I have with buildings that have no style.
Agreed. This also reminds me of the challenge when an architect and a potential client are first meeting and talking, and the client is trying to describe the type of house they like. And so they use these words that I've described, and the architect's, confused by it. I was actually a few months ago now part of a group of architects, and we were talking about various things, and styles came up. And the question was, how do each of you architects respond when a new client approaches you and asks you, what style of architecture do you produce? And I'm asked this question by virtually every single client that approaches me.
Yeah.
Unless they are already familiar with their work, then they don't really ask because they just see the work and they like it and they don't care to label it. And what was fascinating is that in this group, almost all of the architects laughed because they've been asked that question and they know it's almost an impossible question to answer. In fact, there's one guy who does phenomenal work. He's older architect. And he's like, yeah, I don't answer that question. I tell them it's a pointless question. I tell them it's a useless question. I'm like, whoa, that's a pretty tense way to reply. At the same time, though, I fully understand what he's saying and why he says that. And all of us understood that. Because, like we're talking about, the definitions of what they think and what we think is completely... It's baseless, right?
I think it's hard for clients to describe what they like or what they might like.
I
they're
agree.
using
So
the only few words they have in their toolbox to do that. It's not an easy exercise when it's not what you do every day, right?
For sure. So it is on us as a profession and us specifically as an office to problem solve this. So I don't tell people it's a useless question. If I do, I expand upon why that's truly the case. I think other ways to make sure that everyone's envisioning the same thing is to use reference images. Now, reference images are very dangerous because you don't want it, again, to be a copy and paste thing, with the designing of the house in our case. But it is good because now we're on the same page. Like, okay, I know what you're talking about, right? Again, do you do contemporary architecture? I've spoken with clients, they ask me that, and I found out what they envision is the white shitbox modern architecture. Other clients can think that's modern farmhouse with board and batten siding. Other clients rather think it means it's something really avant-garde with a bunch of crazy. And contemporary means almost anything. And the same thing with like modern. So I think images are a much more productive way to be clear about it. The other way, if we're just talking about a conversation, is forget these classifications that have no common definitions. Use other words and descriptions like light and dark, warm and soft, happy and joyful, moody. Not a lot of light, a lot of daylight.
That is actually
more specific.
Yeah, I think this gives a lot more information to the architect and what clients are vibing with. And like physically vibing with, rather than toss around words that are used and misused to mean a bunch of different things.
The other beauty of some of these words that I've just mentioned is that, and this is getting further, like once you're actually designing with somebody, it provides specificity, but also allows for creativity at the same time. We can create a space that's inviting and warm in a million different ways. Versus sometimes when people become too obsessed with reference images, now they're in this like mental zone where it has to, what we produce has to look like that. I'm like, well, it's actually more interesting if we just use these other words and they let us dream up of something that is different and special to you or special to the concept that we're working with here.
But I think that is also a reflection of who the clients are at their core.
Sure.
Clients who are putting a lot of, a weight and meaning on using labels, to me, are clients who are looking to not take many risks and kind of want to, some sort of guaranteed result before even putting pen to paper. Yeah. And then clients who are a bit more, loose in their description, a little bit more dreamy, a little bit, more alluding to, the things that they're into. Are the clients who would probably be open to more radical things and like to be surprised with the design that they see. It's interesting because there is clients who do not want to be surprised, like that, they just want a home and they want something super straightforward, and they're not looking to, questioning what a door wants to be or what a column wants to be. They just want a column. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And again, I mean, all of that is fine. It's just a matter of pairing the right people with the right professionals.
So that's super fascinating, because you might think, people listening, you might think that if an architecture office like us that does modern architecture, I would say that's what we do, that we are therefore a great pairing for a client who loves modern architecture. And that's not necessarily the case. And you might also think that as a modern architecture office that does that work, we are not a good pairing for someone who's interested in a Mediterranean, version of a house. That is also not true.
But that's exactly where,
true.
like the thing that a lot of architects say is like, oh, it's really about finding the right pairing between client and architects, the right, like hire who you vibe with, like is a good tagline that you see around here and there. And it often, I think, kind of like, so what does it mean? Like, are we going to go surf together and therefore I should hire you? Or can we go play pickleball? And, like what kind of affinity do we have to have so I should be hiring you and not someone else?
Right.
And again, a lot of people put the emphasis on the built work and like the work that was previously done by that office. And if you like it, you should hire them for the final product, right? But I think it is actually, you should hire based on the personality match. Like you will be dating someone because you like how they're thinking, or their interests, or how they approach things, or how they deal with situation, right? And not necessarily like because how they look or how they dress.
I think in the context of this conversation, the personality more specifically means the client's interest and appetite for venturing into the unknown.
Yeah.
Which is what a creative design forward office like ours wants. So back to my point about pairing with clients. Years ago, I had a client who loved modern architecture. And I was like, this is perfect. We love modern architecture too. They were the wrong fit because they were obsessed with copying and pasting things from a specific house or whatever it was. And that's not us. That's not the modern ethos, right? At the same time, also before, I was approached by a person who wanted to do a ground up house, and lovely clients, but it wasn't a good fit because they were interested in a style of home that was not. It was Mediterranean. And I was like, yeah, we don't do Mediterranean, which for anyone who doesn't know, we're trying to visualize, it means like, stucco, smooth stucco siding, let's say, exteriors and clay tile roofs, again, black windows that are arches, like this kind of like Mediterranean, whatever. I'm like, yeah, we don't do that. So we're just not the right fit. Anyway, long story short, they pursued us pretty aggressively. We actually turned them away, but they pursued us pretty aggressively. And they said, well, it could be, it doesn't have to be just a copy paste. It can be like a different version of Mediterranean. Actually, no, that's not what happened. That's not what happened. They wanted Mediterranean, and we conceded. We said, okay, fine, because they were a really good person. They needed an architect, and I changed my thinking. We changed our thinking to saying, okay, this is not what we do, but this could be fun. Like it could be interesting to role play, and be the architect who learns about this other style and then channels those rule sets and those details into the home. Like this is going to be interesting, and I was actually
kind of
quite
trying to be a revitalist.
Yeah, but internally, the workaround in my mindset was like, we get to learn about something new because we don't do this, and it actually became sincerely for me quite exciting. I was like, this is really cool to understand something we don't do and then do it. Oddly enough, in the first 3 meetings, the client was the one who pushed us to do something more different, and my eyebrow raised. I'm like, I thought you wanted Mediterranean. In the end, it ended up being that they wanted something that had the feeling of Mediterranean, but it didn't necessarily mean it was going to be a true Mediterranean house. So where we ended up was something that was unexpected. I would have never thought we'd end up in a place with what we had, and they didn't either. And we created together with them this beautiful, really, really cool, very modern house that has, a Mediterranean what's the word? Spirit, material, vibe, energy, details, proportion. I don't know, whatever words you want to use that are somehow woven through the project. And I think that also definitely goes back to some of the early ideas of like modernism being restrictive, it being cold, it being limiting, it not allowing personality to come into the project, blah, 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 blah. It can't be inspired by cultural or context or history. No, it can be a lot of different things. And I actually think the blending of those two was very, very productive, and it produced something new. And again, so on paper, not a good fit for us because the client wants Mediterranean. Great fit because they were quite open-minded about things and they wanted something that was going to be special.
But that's why it comes back to being a personality match.
Yeah.
And it's hard because, clients don't necessarily know like how they are going to be, what is going to be their client personality.
Yeah.
Once they start a project. And oftentimes it probably reveals itself as they go through the process.
It's true. This also reminds me. So mid-century modern architecture is a favorite of ours. I love that type of work. It's a favorite of a lot of people in California. Also, it's confusing because sometimes people say modern, but they really mean mid-century modern, which is specific to the mid-century of the 1900s. I was at a mid-century modern gathering, a modern architecture gathering of sorts a while back. And when I went to this thing, I thought like, this is going to be fun. It's going to be cool. I also thought like, I'm going to be surrounded by my people. And the people there were architects, but also non-architects, just people. I'm like, I'm going to feel a connection with everyone there because of the work that we both like. And I was completely wrong again. Because the people who were so infatuated with mid-century modern architecture, who were not architects,
right.
they fetishized it so much that it might as well have been any other style. They were some of the most closed-minded people I'd ever come across. I'm like, I can't even have a conversation with you, really. And I could never work with you if you were to ask me to be your architect, because despite you liking the same style I like, superficially, in terms of how it looks, you don't have the same mindset whatsoever.
Yeah.
And it would be a constant thing of you referencing Neutro or other projects, but why don't we do this detail? I'm like, yeah, dude.
And actually, like when when offices kind of like select, like take on projects or not, and kind of like have a selection process with a potential client, it's funny because I feel like a lot of times a lot of the questions are, again, focused on the final product rather than like on their mindset. Mm-hmm. And I think we could all use asking more questions that are like, okay, if, you see something that you really like, how would you approach, if you see something you really like over the weekend because you went to some friend's house, like, would you be the type to like, send me an email on Monday, be like, let's put that in the project? Or would you bring up the idea, choice A, let's put that in the project. Choice B, maybe we could consider that for the project. Let's see, I saw something cool. Feel free to ignore it. Just, let's go with what you think is best.
That's a very astute observation in how people communicate. And it says a lot about the people that you're working with in that regard. How they talk about things. I've said it before on the show. It's also people who have a creative background of any kind. It could be dance, it could be sculpture, it could be music, it could be, I'm blanking, whatever else. They tend to have a different like kind of perspective into the work.
I think because they understand that if they go to a creative, a design professional, right, that they're buying their design services, they're buying their creativity
more
right?
than anything
like,
else. Yeah.
You cannot go to Picasso and be like, hey, Picasso, this is the brush you should use, this is the color, this is how many like strokes you should paint to paint my portrait, right?
Yeah,
if you go to a Michelin star restaurant, you're not gonna tell the chef who got the stars like, okay, I think you should have cooked the eggs this way, I think you probably should have served it in that plate, I think it lacks a little bit of salt. I mean, unless you're another Michelin chef, maybe you can do that. I
have two thoughts on that. The first, which I might have said on the show, I was at an Instagram meme video thing, and there's a video of it's a spoof, funny bit, and there's Van Gogh, and he's painting Starry Night.
Oh, I saw it. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like the
yeah,
most
yeah.
iconic thing. Have you ever seen Starry Night in person? It is fucking
I
mesmerizing.
think they have a whole collection
And
of different painters. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So he's working on Starry Night. He's like missing an ear at that point, maybe not. I don't know. He's doing his work, and it's filmed as if it was back in that time. So everyone's wearing historical clothes. Then these two people come in, but they're speaking in contemporary language. Two people come in, and they're like clearly Van Gogh's agents, and they're like, Vincent, how's it going? And he's like, yeah, what do you want? He's like, just coming in to see how you're doing. How's it going, Vincent? He's like, yep, fine. I'm working on the painting that I'm doing for the client. And they're like, yeah. So we just had a nice little round table discussion with the client. Got some ideas to float your way. So Starry Night, they love the title. Fantastic title. It's a little dark. So we're just client's thinking, we should pivot. We should do Starry Night, still great title. Why don't we make it brighter? A daytime Starry Night, interesting. It's different things, right? And you just see Vincent's face. The actor turns, Vincent Van Gogh is like, you want me to make it daytime? Yeah. I think it'd be a great idea. They were the couple you're painting for. They traveled over the weekend. They had a great picnic on the hillside. And they thought, a painting of daytime would be wonderful. And it's a spoof, but there's definitely some truth, some truth to that. I think. I mean, obviously, commissioning a painter to do a painting versus commissioning an architect they're different things. And architecture has the constraints of function and practicality that art does not, which puts it into a different category. But I think the analogy and the comparison to cooking and hiring chefs is an interesting one, because hiring an architect to create a house for you, to design a house for you, is very much like you're commissioning a chef to create a custom menu for some kind of event. In that, let's think through it. You go to them because they're the expert, and you say, okay, I have certain parameters, right? I have to feed X number of people. I need the budget. I can only spend this much on the ingredients. It needs to be done in this amount of time. It needs to be delivered by this point. I need 4 courses. The program, I need an array of savory and sweety and different beverages. You're basically, what I've described in food terms is the program of a building. And then you say also references. I ate at that restaurant. I kind of like that thing. I don't want that same exact thing, but what they did I thought was fascinating. Okay, go. The chef creates their first series of test tastings for you. Client tastes all the stuff and gives you back, and then you repeat until you have the final menu. What you wouldn't do as a client, to your point, is taste the main course and say, hey, this is really good. I'm thinking we add honey to this. Let's add some honey and add some chives. I think this could really make it pop off. That's my feedback. See you soon. No chef would be like, yeah, I'm just going to do that and stick it in there without giving you my input.
And it's going to taste like crap.
They're not going to do that. They're going to say, no, you give me feedback as to saying, I want it, in architecture terms, warmer, darker, lighter, brighter, whatever. In chef terms, it's too salty or whatever it is.
Because there is a reason why
there.
you can't add, honey and chive together, right? Like
probably, I would imagine.
You know what I mean? Like,
but it's the same thing, right? So sometimes we get, and I'm not opposed to getting this type of feedback, because a lot of people, they're just trying their best. Clients, they're just trying their best to be a contributor, and they don't have any other way to describe it, and that's fine. But it's I don't know how we got onto this, but there is that, it's the same type of relationship. And I think balancing, now we're just talking about working with clients and what it means to produce architecture, but balancing the parameters which guide and provide boundaries to what you can do as an architect, balancing that with freedom is a really interesting problem that's always something that we are continually trying to work on, because it's not easy. And oftentimes every project is with a new client, new site, new place. So it's always a new context to a degree. The way I describe it to people, we'll pivot back to the conversation in a second, is like, you have a goal in mind, and we're hired to achieve that goal, and we're going forward. But it's also our job to, in that pathway, deviate from it slightly to make sure that we can propose something that's even better than what you already have in your preconceived notions. But not so much to where it's like, well, dude, you just blew my budget. This has nothing to do with the budget, has nothing to do with the program. You're doing a big sphere. Like, why are you doing a sphere? We don't want to go so far outside of that path, but we do want to have space for wiggle room to venture off of that a little bit to produce something that actually has meaning and is actually going to bring a great value to the client and to the property. Otherwise, if we stay too much within what the client's preconceived notions are, we're producing cafeteria food, and we don't want that.
And basic homes.
And basic homes, because that's what they see, That's what they see.
Yeah, no, I think those are great. I think those are great analogies. And it's almost like, I don't know. I wish that architects or even, the media and all of that would use those analogies to talk about architecture, to explain things to people in a way that maybe resonates a bit more clearly. Because I feel like architecture is still this very abstract sphere of ideas.
We do not do a good job as a profession of informing people of what we do.
I think we're trying to do a better job. I think
we are.
I mean,
probably not.
But not just us. I mean, the modern generation of architects, I think, is pushing that forward because we know it's an issue. But I did want to touch back on the idea of ornamentation.
Okay.
Again, because I don't want people to keep thinking that modern architecture is just like bare bones, right? I think, and there is also different level of ornamentation. There is minimalism, maximalism.
Okay.
I think in the way, let's say, classical architecture was touching on ornamentation was on the maximalist side of it, right? Let's just put it everywhere. Let's just paint the ceilings like multiple colors in churches. Let's just put like
murals,
leaves of ivy and plants and whatever on the top of the columns, make them look fluffy, go ahead. And in a way, a lot of modern architecture is a lot more restrained. Like there's not a lot of like painted murals and things like that.
But that's my
right?
point earlier, right? The mural had meaning for religious reasons, and so it's funny because
but it doesn't mean
these...
that a client that's building a home or a library couldn't have a mural that has a meaning to the library.
A mural of the clients stretched out across the clouds. That'd be awesome. It's funny. So when I think about true classical architecture, and there's always like a vaulted ceiling or a dome ceiling or whatever, there's always a big fantastic mural that's an artwork, basically just artwork on the ceiling. Then you move forward in time to classical architecture that was done more recently. There's nothing up there because first it was expensive to do, so there's like an empty just a flat like plaster dome. You're like, looks kind of cheap. Like, where's all the molding decoration? Where's all the painted babies? It's not up there. One of the forms of ornamentation and modern architecture that's widely accepted as being valid, let's say, and meaningful is to express the materials. So the natural material, the aesthetics that come from a material naturally are the ornamentation of the structure, and you don't need to do it more with, quote, superficial graphics or paintings or like sculptures that are stuck onto the side of the building. So if you have a building that has a bronze cladding, you let the cladding age and weather, or it's distorted naturally, or you do it in the shop to make it look like it's distorted. And there seems to be an honesty to that because the material is speaking for itself, right? And it is ornamentation because it's providing aesthetic value that it's providing aesthetic value, but it's, again, this sort of like unbiased solution.
Yeah, and I think, the modern architect would probably use a process of editing the design. So to make sure there is not, because as creative, we get excited, right? We want to put a lot of stuff in projects because every project is kind of an opportunity to put the details I was always dream on putting, in the kitchen, on the front door, do like a cool roof edge detail, and you kind of want to make sure that the projects end up cohesive and digestible, right? You don't want it to be like overflown with a bunch of stuff tacked on in all of the places, right? So there is a process of editing, and it could go like really far to the end of the spectrum where there is like zero anything, like zero ornamentation, zero detail, and that's very hard to do, to be honest. Like to do really well and not looking like crap. It's very, very hard to do. And then you can kind of like dial it forward a little bit where you do have some of those happening, but in very specific moments, and they do make sense where they happen. And I think that's kind of like the job of what the architect does is create, but also think about the creation and take out or add back things.
Yeah, so this goes back to what I was saying earlier of like, how do you, as an architect, not you specifically, but generally, when you're faced with that blank page and you're drawing stuff, how do you know if what you're drawing makes sense? And what I was saying before is that in a project, you're driven by a lot of things, like the site, again, the client, the program, the budget, all this stuff, but it's not actually enough to make a final determination and final decision of where this wall should go or what shape that wall should be. Should it be just a normal wall where the thickness is the same from the top to bottom? Should it be canted? Should it be thicker at the bottom and narrower at the top? Should it have a bunch of cuts in it? Should it be a screen wall? Should it be a glass wall? Should it be a low wall, a high wall? Should it be a wall that's a curtain? There's an unlimited number of options as to what this wall could be. What is the right solution? And a lot of times, all the stuff I just mentioned, the program, whatever, it's not enough to make that decision. So where does it come from? And we don't have orders to follow. So what do we do? And for me in our office, this really comes down to the concept. It is all about the concept behind the house. Another way to we have recordings about what concept means, but another way to describe concept could be the artistic statement behind the house. Another word would be the narrative or the thesis behind the work. So a good analogy is we look to TV writers and movie writers when they're creating a story. It's interesting when you speak to them or you hear them speak, they're always referring to the story. So like Vince Gilligan comes to mind because I was and am obsessed with Breaking Bad. And there was the panel where it was in the middle of the season, so they hadn't finished the series yet. And there was, Vince Gilligan and all the main actors, and someone asked the question of like, what's going to happen with this character, or like what's going to take place? And he was like, I don't know. It depends on where the story takes us. And everyone was like, what do you mean? But you're the creator. What do you mean? It's the story, this amorphous thing that's floating out there. Like the story is going to give us the answer, but you are the one writing the story. How could it be that you don't know the story when you're the creator of the story? And it also is to say that when we're designing something, and I've said it before, once you find the story of the project, the concept of the architecture, it kind of starts to write and to draw itself. And then you end up being almost simply this conduit between the concept and then what's being put on paper. And your job is just to be a good conduit. And you can sense naturally, once you gain enough experience, when you draw something that you're screwing it up. It feels dishonest. It's editing. It doesn't belong there. Or we need to add something. But you can feel when it's not right. And again, it's almost like what's guiding the hand is not me. It's the story. It's the concept. And there's always a moment in the project where that happens and things start to lock into place. And things become very clear as to what it should be and should not be.
Yeah, and I think, it's kind of like probably the same process as, when you're making a movie and there is kind of like I don't know what you call it, like the director of cinematography or something who kind of, looks at the overall picture and be like, okay, what, that object doesn't make sense here. The colors should be this and that, like that plant, that's extra. Like we don't need this. This person walking in the background, it's distracting. Like let's, tone it down. You kind of need to be able to kind of like zoom back out to the bigger picture and make sure you don't get, carried too far into the detail or the functionality of the project. And
It's so easy to get off track from what we're describing. It's and actually there's a big parallel between writers and directors and architects in that we have this vision that's conceptual. It's floating up in our minds. It doesn't exist anywhere except for in our minds. And we have to see that constantly while also working within the real parameters of whatever we're dealing with. Another good, sticking with the movie kind of analogy, is I love it when I hear that writers or directors are talking about, a character in the movie and what they should be wearing and not wearing, and whether or not, and they always again go back to the story. Does whatever the thing is, the character, the plant, does it serve the story? Does it move the story forward?
Should Harry Potter have round glasses or rectangular glasses?
Everything exists for the purpose of moving that story forward. And if it doesn't do that, then it gets kicked out.
Yeah.
It's the same thing that when we're working. So, Mr. Person in the actor that's in the movie, is he wearing a blue hat? I don't know. Would they actually be wearing a blue hat? Maybe they are if the blue hat is a faded and it's an old baseball hat from whatever period of time. Okay, that makes sense for them, right? The same thing happens for us. Going back to the window thing I was talking about, people might be surprised how much time we and architects in general who care about their work debate and have heavy discourse about the location, shape, style, and just the overall being of a single window. Should that window again be square?
Well, maybe
should it be a
more
sliver?
than others.
Should it be aligned? Should it be not aligned? Should there be no window at all? Why do we have a window? What is a window? What is the purpose that it's serving in the store? We can't just put in a window because it gives light. That's not enough of a reason, right? And so we're constantly looking back to that architectural concept, and that's also why when a foreign object or element is introduced into it, it can drive a creative person nuts because they feel it. It's like this perverse. It doesn't belong. That's also why, again, I think a modern approach to architecture is so freeing, because we invent the rules. We decide per the concept. We follow the concept, but we decide whether or not it should be this or that way. Whether the post should be round, square, cross-shaped, reflective, painted, not painted, wood, whatever it is. There's no one telling us it should be one way or the other.
Yeah, all of that makes me think, okay, fame architects, what would be your ideal project or client? Because we've actually had this question, asked to us several times, and, is it like the location, the project size, the budget? And I think for me, it would be two things. What would be the ideal? What would be the ideal client? I think the ideal client would be someone that is a modernist in their thinking, meaning to say someone who's open to actual creation and open to questioning things and open to being surprised, right? And the ideal project would be a project that challenges me.
Yeah.
I think. And I would say, you know what? Call me tomorrow and ask me to do a French chateau in a modern approach.
That would be interesting.
I think that could be very interesting because that would really be something I would have to figure out,
I'd like to do like a modern Greek temple. And I think when you mix things that are like totally opposites, I think it's a very rich soil that you're playing within.
I think what's interesting about that is that you kind of have to channel what the meaning of that thing was, and how could you basically transcribe that meaning in a way that is not the form it's taken before.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Like, I don't know. What would Marie Antoinette be in 2025 kind of thing? You know what I mean? No, but you know what I mean? Like, it's a little bit like there is a little bit of like constraint and aspiration, but it's understood that you have to look at it from, a contemporary eye and think about it that way.
It's a tricky one. That's a tricky one because there's so many different ways to go about doing that. I'm already thinking about it. There's a lot of different ways to go about doing it. Yeah, I don't know. The question about clients, it's just...
I mean, a client with a lot of money is always great because it gives you more room to, design like nicer things and more time to design things, which I think is also something that is not talked about enough in what we do is time. Time costs money, but time is not just costing money. Time is that... For a creator, having the time to think about the creation is an incredible ingredient to have.
Yeah, David Lynch, I'm a huge fan of David Lynch, and there was a clip of him, and he was, of course, like ranting about something. He was complaining that he didn't have enough time for a shoot. There's actually a bunch of clips of him talking about this. And he's like a lot of cursing. He's like, "Why the fuck do we only have 2 days to shoot? But we're on a stage, we're on a set, we're not on a location. We can spend as much time as we want here." It's like, back in that place, I could have been there for 2 weeks. I could have dreamt of all kinds of cool stuff. It's wonderful to be there. And of course, production is like, well, Mr. Lynch, we have like a budget and a schedule to adhere to. But of course, I get what he's saying. Like, there is when you're creating something, you just need time to reflect.
Well, it's like if you look back at like Starry Night, right? Van Gogh did not count how many hours. Okay, well, I only have 3 hours to finish this, so let's wrap it up.
Well, unless he had those clients.
No, but like we need to say like any artist or creator or I don't know, the Beatles, like did they were like, okay, we got to create an album in 3 days, guys.
But you do have to have. You
have to have some parameters. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, otherwise you just.
Otherwise you just go bored, but. I feel like in today's age, everything has to be so quick all the time. That is, it is a little hard sometimes to push the boundary.
Well, I think that's every architecture office really needs to think about this, and how do you create a workflow? Let's say, sounds very corporate, but a workflow that allows for that kind of dreaminess and the creativity. And there's ways to do it within a very structured manner, but you just have to. You have to figure it out. And obviously, the more experience you have, the faster you are at it. It's funny, as we're talking, some of the best design decisions I've ever made were when I'm like just cooking dinner or whatever. Like nothing. I'm not at my desk.
Are you cook dinner?
No, yeah, I'm making. I was trying to go. What do I do? I don't do anything really. But grocery shopping. Like some of the best, like actual decisions, not just like thinking, but decisions, are rendered in this kind of third space of being, where there's not the sense of a time, there's not the feeling of pressure. The deadline hasn't moved, right? But it just happens to be that in that pocket of space and time during the day, there's not the feeling of the deadline. And then naturally, like there's something comes up, like why don't we do that instead?
That's good to know that when you hire David, he's thinking about your project when he's grocery shopping, and those are non-billable hours. So
the line, no, of course not.
No, but but that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's kind of like the project has to kind of linger and settle into your brain a little bit, so you can think about it in a more relaxed way.
Yeah,
a lot of the time.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, to sum it up, I suppose, what modern architecture for us, I think broadly speaking too, it's really more of an approach and a philosophy, much more than anything else about how things look. I mean,
I think that's kind of the big conclusion to this, conversation is for clients who are listening to this, kind of like stop focusing so much on the labels that whoever established their meaning out there, and focus more on the approach and like what you're looking for as a client. Are you looking to a very prescribed creation that you're dictating in a way, or are you looking for a more loose process that's a bit more open-ended, and trying to understand the architect you're looking to hire? What is their approach? Are they more of a revivalist? Are they more of a modern contemporary architect? Are they something else that we've missed? But
it's interesting though, because when we're talking about the modern and contemporary architecture, just repeat the same thing over and over and over again. I'm like, there's two ways to interpret that. One is that they found their groove, right? And they're refining it over time. That's what they would say. Yeah. The other is like, well, aren't you boring of doing like fucking white minimalist stuff like indefinitely? Like you've done that for 30 years. Like we get it. It's a bunch of white walls. Looks good, but like, aren't you bored? Like at some point,
it's a business decision. It is not necessarily a true belief. Like
I personally,
if you found the best cookie recipe and you can repeat it 500 times over the course of your cooking career, then that's one way to make sure you make money. But
it's also, I think there's a balancing between efficiency and then they're not different, but efficiency and also the reinvention of things. Mm-hmm. So even internally as an office, it's much more efficient to repeat things over and over again. Use the same details from every project. Just copy and paste those details into your CD set, right? Because they're the same thing. Probably the same kind of floor plan, probably the same kind of roof, like the same everything. And you're very, very efficient about that. But I don't know, for me and a lot of the people that I know, other architects, you are searching for efficiency in your process to give a better service to your clients. But I'm not in search of efficiency for the sake of like repeating details and palettes and stuff from one thing to the next, at least at this point. I don't
I
find
think you
it.
can find efficiency in your workflow, like how
Right.
I don't know, how you use software, how you go about, I don't know, permit drawings.
You can find efficiency in being creative
and
too.
all of that. And yeah, and some of it, but I don't think you can. I mean, there is different capes out there for sure.
Yeah. And there's also balancing too. I mean, like, for people listening, they're like, okay, so what? You need clients who are just open to anything? Like, no, of course not. That's not true. Like, we are a service profession. People have their preferences, and it's totally fine. That's the part of why, like earlier on, I was talking about different words to use or reference images and how we onboard people. It's a very, very important part of the process that we take very seriously. Again, to make sure we're heading in the right direction, but giving a little bit of breathing room. Right? If they are infatuated and they want a monochromatic or beige tone, warm, people call it wabi-sabi, whatever feeling, that feeling of house, fine, let's rock and roll, let's do it. Or let's zen out and let's do it. But let's find a different way to get there so that we're not being limited. That's the only thing. So anyway, I hope the conversation clarified what modern
or maybe confused people
architecture
more.
confused them, which is a good place to be also. Got to be a little confused.
That's what the modern architect is. They're confused all the time because they're questioning everything.
But really, though, I mean, that is the biggest difference. That's why architects as a group were just confused when people were using these terms. We're like, what do you mean? Do I do modern architecture? Do I do contemporary architecture? It's just confusing to us.
So if you have any questions about modern architecture, you can reach out to David's cell phone personally. No, I'm kidding. You could reach out, though. You just call or text the hotline 213-222-6950. But seriously, though, if you are a potential client and you're very confused to, what is modern architecture still, or if you have any thoughts about it, feel free to reach out. If you do like the show and you enjoyed this episode, you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe on Spotify, and we're also on YouTube. So make sure you check all of our channels. You can find us on Instagram, social media.
Yeah.
This was a brain-heavy recording. And a long day. We're on social media. Make sure you check us out. We have a nice following there, and we do post fairly regularly, so you can kind of see like what we're up to, or if there is any episode that you missed and you might see a clip and be like, I'm intrigued. Like, let's tune into this one. Check it out. What else? We have a lot more coming up. Some episodes with guests and just the two of us, and a lot more like this. So,
and I'm also curious if for the architects listening, if you have a different. If historically speaking, what we said is correct, so I don't need to hear about that, but in how you practice architecture, when you have to convey the idea of modern architecture and what you do as modern architecture to people, what do you say? How do you describe it? Do you see yourself as a modern architect in the historical sense? You follow those three principles strictly? Do you push away from that? How do you define ornamentation in modern architecture? Let's hear.
Let's hear it. Contact David, 213-222-6950.
My personal cell phone.
And again, as usual, thank you guys for supporting the show. It means a lot.
And we'll talk soon.
We'll talk soon.
Okay, thanks, bye.